In the spring of 1989, an American company briefly controlled more warships than most nations on Earth. Not a defense contractor, not an oil company, a soft drink company, the same one probably sitting in your fridge right now, selling for less than $2 a bottle. Submarines, a destroyer, a frigate, a cruiser, all owned, for a short and strange moment, by the people who make Pepsi. How does a soda company end up with a small navy? To answer that, we need to go back almost 100 years earlier, to a quiet drugstore on a street corner in North Carolina, and a pharmacist who had no idea he was about to spend the rest of his life chasing, and mostly losing to, Coca-Cola. This is the story of Pepsi. A story about bankruptcy, twice, about a lawsuit that reshaped American corporate law, about a movie star who turned soda into spectacle, about the Cold War being fought, in a small way, with a straw, and about a company that never quite managed to outsell its biggest rival, and somehow became bigger anyway. If you like finding the strange, true stories hiding behind the ordinary brands you've walked past your whole life, this channel is for you. Subscribe, because there's a lot more history sitting quietly on supermarket shelves than most of us ever stop to notice. Before we go any further, here's something I want to know. When you're standing at a cooler, and it's Pepsi on one side and Coke on the other, which one do you actually reach for, and why? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how split this really is. Now, back to that pharmacist. His name was Caleb Bradham. In the early 1890s, he owned a small pharmacy in New Bern, North Carolina, the kind of place with a soda fountain built right into the front counter. This was completely normal for the time. Long before supermarkets sold soft drinks by the case, drugstores mixed sodas up themselves, one glass at a time, often selling them as tonics for whatever ailed you. Dozens of small cola brands were doing the exact same thing across the country, all competing for space against one company that already dominated the market, Coca-Cola, which had been selling since 1886. Bradham liked to experiment behind the counter. He mixed sugar, water, vanilla, rare oils, and cola nut extract, and landed on something his regulars loved so much they nicknamed it, before he'd even settled on an official name, Brad's Drink. By 1898, Bradham had renamed it. He called it Pepsi Cola. Here's a detail people repeat constantly, and it might not even be true. The popular version says the name came from pepsin, a digestive enzyme, because Bradham believed his drink settled an upset stomach. It's a great story. It's also disputed. Some historians say pepsin really was part of that early recipe. Others, including Pepsi's own historical materials, insist pepsin was never actually in the formula, and that the name more likely borrowed from dyspepsia, the medical term for indigestion. Either way, the promise to customers was the same. This wasn't just a treat. It was supposed to make you feel better. For a while, that promise worked, in more ways than one. Bradham incorporated his company in 1902. By 1910, he had roughly 300 bottlers spread across 24 states. By every visible measure, he was a success story. A small-town druggist who'd built something outgrowing his hometown, his state, and creeping toward becoming a household name. Then came a war, and a bet that undid all of it. World War I sent sugar prices into chaos. Before the war, sugar cost around 3 cents a pound. Wartime shortages and rationing pushed that closer to 30 cents a pound. Bradham did what plenty of business owners would do in that moment. He tried to plan ahead, buying enormous quantities of sugar at that high price, betting the cost would keep climbing. It didn't. When the war ended, sugar prices collapsed back down to just a few cents a pound. Bradham was now sitting on a mountain of sugar he'd paid a small fortune for, in a market where that same sugar was suddenly worth almost nothing. He couldn't just raise the price of Pepsi to cover the loss either, because the entire brand had been built on a simple promise: a nickel a bottle. Break that promise, and you break the trust the whole business was standing on. He was trapped between a price he couldn't raise and costs he couldn't lower. In 1923, Pepsi-Cola declared bankruptcy. Sit with that for a second. The man who invented Pepsi didn't lose to Coca-Cola in the marketplace. He lost to a sugar contract. Bradham went back to running his drugstore and never tried to rebuild the company. He died in 1934, having sold off his own invention years earlier for a fraction of what it would eventually be worth. You'd be forgiven for assuming that's where Pepsi's story ends. It isn't. It's barely the beginning. The Pepsi name and formula got passed to a Wall Street broker who tried and failed to revive it, and by 1931, Pepsi-Cola had gone bankrupt again, twice bankrupt in 8 years. At this point, most brands simply vanish. Pepsi very nearly did. What saved it wasn't clever marketing. It was a grudge. A candy company executive named Charles Guth ran Loft Incorporated, a chain of candy stores with soda fountains built right into them. Loft was one of Coca-Cola's biggest customers, buying enormous volumes of syrup every year, and Guth figured that kind of volume deserved a discount. He asked Coca-Cola for one. Coca-Cola said no. Guth was furious, and instead of accepting it, he went looking for a replacement. He found a nearly dead, twice bankrupt little brand out of North Carolina, and in 1931, he personally bought its trademark and secret formula out of bankruptcy court for around $10,000, putting Loft's own chemists to work reformulating the recipe. There was just one problem. Guth hadn't bought Pepsi for Loft, the company he was actually supposed to be running. He'd bought it for himself. Loft's shareholders eventually found out, and they were furious. They sued Guth, arguing that any business opportunity he found using the company's money, staff, and resources belonged to Loft, not to him personally. The case, Guth versus Loft, dragged through Delaware courts for years and became one of the most cited cases in American corporate law, essentially defining what a company boss legally owes the business he runs. The courts sided with the shareholders. Guth was ordered to hand his Pepsi-Cola stock over to Loft, so the man who'd saved Pepsi purely out of spite toward Coca-Cola ended up losing control of it because of that same spite. But before he lost it, Guth had already reshaped Pepsi into something that could survive. In the middle of the Great Depression, when every American family was counting nickels, Pepsi began selling 12-ounce bottles for a nickel, the exact price Coca-Cola charged for just 6 ounces, twice the drink, same price. Guth's successor, Walter Mack, who took over as president in 1938, leaned even harder into that math. In 1939, Pepsi backed the 12-ounce bottle with a catchy little radio jingle that spelled out the value proposition in a few sung lines any listener could repeat after one hearing. It became the first jingle ever broadcast coast to coast across America, was eventually translated into more than 50 languages, and is still remembered today as one of the most effective advertisements of the entire 20th century. And this is the real turning point. Pepsi had found something Coca-Cola wasn't willing to compete on. Not better taste, not richer history, just better value. During a depression, value was exactly what people needed, and the company's fortunes turned around fast. Pepsi survived the Second World War and came out the other side, a genuine national competitor, still far behind Coca-Cola, but no longer a joke. Then, in 1950, Pepsi hired a new chief executive, and this next detail sounds almost too strange to be true. His name was Alfred Steele, and before joining Pepsi, he had been a vice president at Coca-Cola. That's not a coincidence you'd expect. Coca-Cola had personally trained the executive who'd go on to spend the next decade trying to beat them. Steele poured money into advertising and sales promotions on a scale Pepsi hadn't attempted before, and it worked. Under him, the company's earnings multiplied roughly 11-fold across the decade. But Steele didn't just change Pepsi's marketing budget. He changed its public face, literally, by marrying one of the biggest movie stars in America. In 1955, Steele married the Academy Award-winning actress Joan Crawford. Crawford didn't just stay home and smile for photos. She became Pepsi's glamorous, globe-trotting ambassador, touring bottling plants, meeting local franchise owners, turning a soda company's routine business trips into genuine Hollywood events. When Steele died suddenly of a heart attack in 1959, Crawford took his seat on Pepsi's board and kept working for the brand for well over a decade afterward, reportedly even placing Pepsi bottles in some of her own films. There's a story, often repeated, that after Crawford was denied membership at an exclusive Manhattan apartment building run by a former Coca-Cola executive, Coca-Cola's own internal blind taste tests were quietly producing the same uncomfortable result Pepsi had been advertising for years. People kept picking the sweeter drink. Coca-Cola's market share had been slipping against Pepsi for over a decade. Something had to change, and Coca-Cola's leadership decided the answer was to alter the one thing that had never changed in 99 years: the formula itself. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola's CEO stood in front of a room full of reporters at New York's Lincoln Center and unveiled a new, sweeter formula, nicknamed New Coke, calling it the boldest move in the company's history. Pepsi didn't wait to see how it would play out. Word had leaked in the days beforehand, and Pepsi's president, Roger Enrico, moved immediately. On the very day of Coca-Cola's press conference, full-page Pepsi ads ran in major newspapers, declaring that the cola wars were over and Pepsi had won. A few days later, Enrico gave Pepsi's entire American workforce a paid day off to celebrate. Strip the legend away, and the record shows something simpler. The backlash against New Coke wasn't really about taste for most people. It was about identity and tradition. Coca-Cola received tens of thousands of angry phone calls. Loyal customers felt like something had been taken from them that was bigger than a soft drink. Less than 3 months after New Coke launched, Coca-Cola brought the original formula back, rebranded as Coca-Cola Classic, and the reversal made headlines everywhere. There's a theory, repeated online for years, that New Coke was secretly designed to fail on purpose, just to make people miss the original and love it even more once it returned. Coca-Cola has always denied this, and most historians treat it as far-fetched. What actually seems to have happened is simpler, and honestly more human. A company got scared by its rival's momentum, made an enormous bet to fix it, and watched that bet blow up in a way nobody predicted. And Pepsi, without changing its own product at all, walked away from the entire episode looking like the smartest company in the room. But the biggest twist in Pepsi's whole story wasn't unfolding in American malls or New York press conferences. It was unfolding on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and it had started years earlier, almost by accident. In the summer of 1959, in the middle of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to something unusual: an exhibition in Moscow where America could show off its consumer products to Soviet citizens: appliances, cars, art, fashion. Vice President Richard Nixon flew in to open it, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev toured it alongside him. While walking the exhibit, Nixon and Khrushchev got into a heated, unscripted argument about capitalism versus communism, standing in front of a mock American kitchen. It's remembered today as the kitchen debate, one of the most famous exchanges of the entire Cold War. Pepsi had a booth at that same exhibition. Coca-Cola, notably, had turned down the invitation to attend. And the man running Pepsi's international division, a young executive named Donald Kendall, saw an opportunity that had nothing to do with kitchens. He wanted Khrushchev photographed drinking a Pepsi in front of the world's press. Kendall convinced Nixon to steer Khrushchev toward the Pepsi booth during their walk. Khrushchev accepted a cup, and photographers caught the moment. The leader of the Soviet Union sipping an American soft drink, right there in Moscow. It became one of the most reprinted photographs of the era, worth more to Pepsi than any advertising campaign could have bought. A photograph isn't a business deal, though. It took Kendall another 13 years to turn that moment into something real. In 1972, Pepsi signed an agreement making it the first American consumer product ever manufactured and sold inside the Soviet Union. There was just one complication. The Soviet ruble couldn't be exchanged on international markets. The Soviets literally could not pay Pepsi in ordinary money, so they paid in vodka instead. PepsiCo received exclusive rights to import and distribute Stolichnaya vodka across the United States in exchange for the concentrate and equipment it shipped into the Soviet Union. For close to 2 decades, Soviet citizens drank Pepsi, Americans drank Stolichnaya, and neither government ever handed the other a single dollar. By the late 1980s, though, Pepsi's Soviet business had grown so large that vodka alone couldn't balance the books anymore. Pepsi wanted to expand further, and the Soviets, still without convertible currency, needed something else of genuine value to offer. So in 1989, they offered Pepsi something almost nobody would expect a soft drink company to accept: military hardware, 17 aging submarines, along with a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer, plus a fleet of oil tankers Pepsi could lease or resell on the open market. This is the moment from the very start of this video. For a brief window in 1989, PepsiCo, on paper, controlled a small navy. You'll sometimes hear it claimed that this technically made Pepsi the 6th largest naval power on the planet. That exact ranking is more of a fun exaggeration passed around online than a verified fact, so take it with a grain of salt. But the deal itself, the actual submarines, the actual warships, all of it checks out. None of the vessels were combat ready. These were old, aging ships, worth far more as scrap metal than as weapons, so that's exactly what Pepsi did with them. Sold them off to be scrapped. Pepsi's chairman later joked to a U.S. government official that his company was disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are. Barely 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed entirely. Pepsi, the same brand that had spent years trading soda for submarines, became one of the first American products sold in the new, post-Soviet Russia. Somewhere along the way, a home remedy from a North Carolina drugstore had turned into an actual instrument of Cold War diplomacy. Bradham could never have imagined it. But by this point, Pepsi wasn't just a drink company chasing Coca-Cola anymore. It was becoming something much bigger and stranger than either company had ever been before. Back home, in 1965, Pepsi's leadership made a decision that would end up shaping the company's future more than any single ad campaign or Cold War handshake. Pepsi-Cola merged with Frito-Lay, the snack food company behind Fritos and Lay's potato chips, forming a new parent company, PepsiCo. The logic was almost embarrassingly simple. Pepsi's own chief executive summed it up at the time in 7 words: potato chips make you thirsty. Pepsi satisfies thirst. Salt and sugar, sold side by side, under one roof. Over the following decades, PepsiCo kept expanding well beyond soda and snacks. It bought Pizza Hut in 1977, Taco Bell in 1978, and KFC in 1986, briefly turning a beverage company into one of the largest restaurant operators on the planet. Then, in 1997, PepsiCo decided restaurants weren't really its focus after all. and spun that entire division off into its own company, the one you probably know today by its later name, Yum Brands. Instead, PepsiCo doubled down on food and drink. It bought the juice giant Tropicana in 1998. In 2001, it merged with Quaker Oats, a deal that brought Gatorade into the family along with it. Then, in December of 2005, something happened that would have sounded impossible to Caleb Bradham, or Charles Guth, or even Alfred Steele. For the first time in the two companies' shared history, PepsiCo's total market value pulled ahead of Coca-Cola's. Here's the strange wrinkle in that victory, though. PepsiCo overtook Coca-Cola in value without ever once outselling it in cola. Even today, Coca-Cola still sells more soda than Pepsi does. But by then, soda wasn't really what PepsiCo was anymore. The majority of the company's business had quietly shifted into salty snacks, sports drinks, and packaged food. Pepsi had won a version of the war, just not the one everybody originally assumed it was fighting. So what is Pepsi today? It's still one of the most recognized drink brands on earth, still going head-to-head with Coca-Cola in commercials and on store shelves. But the battlefield has shifted again. Per-person soda consumption in the United States has been quietly declining for years, as more people pay attention to sugar and long-term health, and brand loyalty itself now gets fought over on social media as much as on television. Pepsi's response has echoed its response during the Great Depression. Adapt to what people actually want, instead of trying to convince them to want something else. Pepsi Zero Sugar has posted double-digit sales growth in recent years. The company has bought its way into entirely new categories, picking up energy drink brands to compete with newer names crowding the cooler. Brands like Celsius and Monster that barely existed a generation ago, and moving into the newer wave of prebiotic, gut health sodas that didn't exist at all until very recently. It's the same instinct Walter Mack had with that 12-ounce bottle back in the 1930s. Figure out what the customer actually wants and get there before your rival does. So think back to where we started. A soft drink company briefly holding submarines and warships. It sounds like something out of fiction. It isn't. That fizzy drink, whichever side of the cooler you reach for, carries the fingerprints of a small-town pharmacist who lost everything to a bad sugar bet, a candy executive who broke corporate law out of pure spite and lost the company anyway, a Hollywood star who turned soda into spectacle, a Cold War photograph that took 13 years to become a real business deal, and a fleet of Soviet warships that ended their careers as scrap metal instead of weapons. Pepsi never quite managed to outsell Coca-Cola. Not in 1938, not in 1975, not today. But somewhere in the middle of trying, it stopped needing to win that particular fight. It became something Coca-Cola never fully became. A snack company, a food company, an operation so diversified that soda is almost a side note to what it actually does now. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting inside every can. You don't always have to beat your competition at their own game. Sometimes you win by building an entirely different game right next to them, until one day you look up and realize you've become bigger than they are. If you liked pulling back the curtain on one of the most familiar brands on the planet, hit like and subscribe if you're not already, because there's a lot more of this kind of thing hiding in plain sight. And if a soda company secretly owning a navy caught you off guard, wait until you hear what's hiding inside almost everything you eat. Not a company, not a brand, a single crop, quietly folded into more of your daily life than you've probably ever stopped to consider. That's coming up next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Because it turns out, the ordinary things sitting in your fridge and your pantry are rarely as ordinary as they look. You just have to ask how they got there.